Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot of the week's biggest economic and business stories, their context, their relevance and policy impact. I'm Govindraj, Ethiraj. India's GDP numbers are out. They stood at a robust 7% for the third quarter of 2016 from October to December, the period most impacted by the government's move to demonetize 500 and 1000 rupee notes, which took out 86% of the currency notes in circulation. Now, the 7% figure was slower than the 7.4% in the previous quarter, but higher than the 6.4% forecasted by most economists. The GDP numbers have been received with some skepticism, as some GDP constituents such as private consumption expenditure were up 10.1% in the quarter, the highest in 5 years. Now, the larger question we are asking is, what do these numbers reflect and what do they not? Also, what is the real impact of demonetization as we look back, and what are the broader areas of economic concern, if any? To discuss this, I am joined by Soumya Kanti Ghosh, Group Chief Economic Advisor of the State Bank of India, and Sujan Hazra, Chief Economist at Anand Rathi Securities. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me. So, let me begin with you, Soumya. So, you've put out a report where you seem to say that basically your understanding or your study of listed companies shows actually much higher numbers in terms of revenue and also a higher cash component flowing into revenues. Is that one reason why the GDP numbers are looking so strong?
Yeah, see, actually I think you are talking from the expenditure side. That is the reason why we have set out that a large number of companies in the third quarter, possibly they have shown cash as net sales. And if I look at the numbers, reality is one of them, construction sector is one of them, even some companies in the oil and refinery sector. So that has been one of the reasons why the manufacturing sector growth rate has been significantly on the higher side, and also because of the fact that there is also has been impact on the private final consumption expenditure. So our argument is that the 8.3% growth rate in GDP in Q3, which has been recently released by the CSO, has been largely to do with these corporates showing cash as a percentage of net sales. So therefore, if the net sales goes up, the excess tax collection goes up, obviously that should push up the GDP numbers to an extent.
Right, okay. Sujan, what's your sense? I mean, what's your first takeaway? Then we'll come to the specifics.
First of all, you see the quarterly numbers as they come for the first time, they are not particularly reliable. And this is nothing to do with demonetization. As such, they are very not very firm numbers. Second thing, perpetually what we are seeing, that you are revising the corresponding base of the previous year. So obviously that gives a boost. Having said that, obviously the impact of demonetization, what you are expecting during third quarter and the actual outcome, this looks far too rosy. But there can be legitimate reasons for which this can be. For example, what you hear is that the people are pushing their inventories.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Advanced
sales,
that can be one reason. People actually, whatever areas they had, for example, in terms of tax payment or other kind of payments to the suppliers, they paid it up with the old currency notes. So this can be a one-off effect of pushing the old currencies to the system. So in that sense, that might have neutralized the impact. So if that is the case, we'll see some impact of demonetization in the fourth quarter as well.
So could that be then, could it be said then that there is really no impact of demonetization then? We're not talking about informal, we're talking about formal now. Yeah. So either way, if there was cash and the cash came into the system and the cash would have come in any case, either as physical cash or as check, then maybe it is genuine economic activity.
No, see, the point is that there is no denial of the fact that there was a slowdown of activities during this period. Say, for example, 95% of our retail transactions are cash-based. About 50% of the wholesale transactions are cash-based. And we know for sure that particularly the wholesale channels and even the retail sales are seriously impacted during this period. Now, what happens is that this process has actually helped the organized sector. So the negative impact which you have seen in the unorganized sector, it's very difficult to capture that contemporaneously. So this impact might get reflected going forward.
Right. Okay. So Soumya, you seem to be making a similar point in your report. You're saying that basically areas like diamonds, gems and jewelry, mining, realty, construction, they were areas which actually benefited in this transition, albeit temporary, from informal to formal economy.
Yes, of course, and I think there is another reason which you have put out in one of the earlier reports on GDP. I think this is also, I think, a very fascinating argument. I don't know how this, how this is going to look up in the future, but another thing, if you look into the GDP data very closely from the expenditure side, you will see that the valuables component has in fact declined a lot. Value is basically the purchase on gold, and if you remember in November, December, a lot of people, because of the decline in gold prices, that could have been the result. So my sense is that since this expenditure on private final consumption expenditure is estimated as a residual, a part of that valuables could have moved to PFC, and that may have pushed up the growth to PFC at 9 to 10%. And this is from the expenditure side. And from the demand side, as we are just pointing out, the revisions in the earlier years, the significant increase in tax collections, pushing up the wage between GDP and GVA to by around 40 basis points. So I think all these numbers needs to be looked into proper perspective, but I admit that the impact of demonetization possibly will be felt over the subsequent quarter, that is Q4. When the final numbers are received.
Right, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So, Sujan, the other question is to do with the informal economy. A lot of the pain that's been recorded anecdotally through reports is obviously in the informal economy. Should we be concerned that this is not reflecting at all in GDP numbers in general, nothing to do with demonetization in specific?
No, the problem, see, obviously you capture the informal sector also. You have benchmark surveys through which you, though it takes a longer time to capture it, but you have the ratios with which you tinker account. But having said that, I think the real concern is not so much statistical as it in terms of employment generation. If you look at the semi-formal and the unorganized sector, they in the non-agricultural employment, they account for 2/3 of the overall employment.
Yeah.
If we think this move towards demonetization, move towards digitalization, move towards GST, if that marginalizes this unorganized and semi-organized sectors, then the employment problem which we have already have, that can take a much bigger shape. So I don't think really it's the accounting problem which is bothering me, but I would say the employment prospects are much bigger issue here.
Right, but the economy has been remonetized, so that part of the issue has been addressed. There's only GST that's now looming on the horizon.
No, the fact of the matter, why the unorganized or semi-organized sector they are doing on cash basis, there are a lot of reasons for that. So part of the reasons maybe they are paying less than the minimum wages.
Right.
But having said that, that creates employment.
Right.
And
yeah.
so
and their business model is sometimes predicated on not paying all the taxes.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I'm not telling those are good things, paying lower than minimum wages or not declaring your income, but having said that, that generates economic activity.
Right. So, Soumya, you know, as we look ahead, the digitization, the transition from informal to formal, how much of this is secular or will be secular versus how much of it is likely to come back to where it was before?
See, it's very difficult to say at this point how much will be stable, but I think that if you ask me, there was initially a huge amount of surge in the digital transaction, but I think as per the latest report shows, the surge in transactions on the UPI, the Universal Payment Interface, is now more than what is happening in the other areas. And I think once as you know, the government has already announced that they will set up Aadhaar-based, they will ask banks to set up Aadhaar-based POS machines by September 2017 or so. And once these Aadhaar-based POS machines comes into the picture, a lot of these transactions will actually happen through this Universal Payment Interface. So I think digital will continue to happen, but it could manifest it in other platforms like payment interface, the phone numbers, the transactions and all these things, rather than purely happening in terms of say an wallet or other options which are now currently available in the market.
I'm going to pose to both of you. So as we now look at the Jan to March quarter, and we've only got a month left for that, and assuming a little more time before the actual GDP numbers come out, what's your sense? What's going to happen and what's the full year likely to look like?
See, full year GDP, we are still maintaining that the full year GDP growth rate could be closer to 6.6%. So I think I'm not sure whether May 2017 will show some amount of revision for the Q4. It may show a little amount of, it may show some amount of demonetization impact factored in. But I think the larger part of the revisions could come in the January 2018. But as of now, even if you grow by say 6.6% in the current fiscal year, which is of course an 100 basis point down from what we had done last year, I tend to believe that we have done reasonably well, given the fact that the global economy continues to be uncertain and the demand in the domestic economy still continues to be a laggard. So a growth rate of possibly around 6.6% in the final analysis is what we are pegging as of now.
Right. So Sujan, what's your prognosis, and you know, for the quarter this year and for the full year?
I have actually a diametrically different view here. My sense is that the growth number for fourth quarter will be pretty close to 8%, despite some impact, spillover impact of the demonetization. simply because of two factors. You have already got somewhere close to 60,000 crore in the first voluntary disclosure. Remember, this part was not part of formal GDP, and say 60,000 crore is about 3.5%, 0.35% of GDP growth. If you assume the second voluntary disclosure will bring in similar amount of money, so you are talking about 0.7% of GDP growth.
But that's one-off, right?
That's one-off, but that's going to impact your fourth quarter number.
Okay.
So my sense is that fourth quarter number being very close to 8%, obviously people will take it with a bucket of salt. But having said that, that's
so you're saying 7.3% plus 0.7% of your VDIs.
In the accounting sense, that's pretty much possible.
Okay. So and what does that, or where does that leave us as far as the full year is concerned?
7.4% kind of a number.
7.4. That's way ahead of what Soumya is saying.
Absolutely, it's way ahead of the consensus.
Okay, and your ground for that optimism is only the fourth quarter or overall?
My sense, our sense is that if you look at the personal income tax growth number, it's growing at more than 20%. Whereas the corporate income tax for the first 9 months is growing at 4%. Obviously, people are overstating their current year income to avoid getting caught. So, but effectively what's happening, a part of your black economy is becoming a part of your white economy. There is no difference in the level of economic activity, but that in the accounting sense, that inflates your GDP.
Right. So that's a very optimistic note to end on, and many people would like you for saying that. Thank you, Sujan. Thank you, Soumya. Let's see how the GDP numbers pan out, particularly for the last quarter. We'll of course be back on that at some point in Policy Watch. We need to go in for a break now. Coming up on the other side, we look at bank balance sheets. Stay with us.
Once a private game reserve of the Royal House of Jaipur, Ranthambore. This national park and tiger reserve is one of the world's best known wilderness areas. Located 14 kilometers from Savai Madhopur, Ranthambore offers some of the finest opportunities for sighting the magnificent tiger in the wild. Comprising 1,334 square kilometers of wild jungle scrub, hemmed in by rocky ridges, and at its center is the 10th century Ranthambore fort. The dainty cheetal, sambar deer, the blue bull antelope or nilgai, rhesus macaque, langur, and an incredible variety of birds amidst a setting of dhok, fig and banyan trees makes a visit to this park a delight.
Welcome back to Policy Watch. Reserve Bank Deputy Governor Viral Acharya last week revisited the issue of non-performing assets, now worth over $133 billion in the banking system, by proposing the creation of a bad bank type of institution which would buy and restructure stressed loans. He also touched upon some of the defaulters having a field day and banks in turn kicking the can down the road, essentially postponing the recognition of some loans as bad assets. Now, the larger question that we're asking is, what is the way forward? What are the structures that are feasible, and who will bear the cost of reviving banks, which in turn should hopefully free up capital for economic growth? Joining me to discuss this are Hemendra Hazari, banking analyst, and Krishnan Sitaraman, senior director at CRISIL Ratings. Thank you both for joining us. Hemendra, so let me begin with you. So, there is a problem that seems to be recurring time and again, right? Or at least the discussion of it. Is the problem somewhat now resolved compared to where it was a year ago, or is it worse than ever before? Where do you see this?
Well, the problem of NPAs has been mounting every year. So we have not yet seen, even a plateauing of that, and it's going to continue to mount. Now,
why is that?
Because the economy is in a slowdown mode, despite whatever the GDP numbers may report. There's widespread contamination of large corporates. The SME sector has been very badly hit, even before demonetization. And because of demonetization, there's going to be even problem with agriculture and even retail loans in the future. So all these assets are now coming home to roost.
Right. So you're saying the problem is mounting. So now the solutions. So we've been looking at various kinds of solutions. One, of course, is to give money to the bank so that they actually recapitalize themselves, so that they get money and somehow these old non-performing assets are wiped out. Is that the right way to go forward?
See, whenever there are losses in any entity, it has to be recapitalized. Now, when the government is the majority shareholder, it is the responsibility of the government to recapitalize the banks to the extent possible to cover up for the losses. Because mind you, some of these very large infrastructure loans that the banks gave out, actually they did it so as to give a boost to the economy in those years, was done on the explicit instructions of the government of India. Now, having seen that there's been an economic slowdown and a lot of the projections of these infrastructure projects did not pan out the way it should, and also there's been a lot of siphoning off from these infrastructure projects by the promoters. Now, therefore, when the government has given instructions for the banks to lend, and now things have not worked out, it is the responsibility of the government to recapitalize the banks.
Right, and I'm going to go to Krishnan in a moment, but you made an interesting point. You said that promoters are also responsible for some of the mess by siphoning out funds, if not maybe let's say the business risk that these companies have had to face. So then who should really pick up the bill, and why should it only fall on the banks?
No, correct. Today, from what we're seeing is that the government is allowing errant corporate borrowers to escape this country. And the banks who have lent to them are being held to task and put into police custody. So there seems to be different rules, one for bankers and another totally liberal rule for errant corporate borrowers. Therefore, the solution has to be it has to be a twofold attack. One is you have to improve the autonomy of these government banks. You have to recapitalize them, as well as you have to have a massive campaign against those corporate borrowers who have siphoned considerable amounts of money, because a lot of these assets are fictitious. Unfortunately, we really don't see any effort on the government to go after these errant corporate borrowers, and they have all the agencies at their disposal, the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Enforcement Directorate. These agents are meant to catch economic crimes.
Right. Okay. So we'll come to that in a moment. Krishnan, what's your sense, looking at it from a ratings point of view? How would you diagnose the problem as it stands today? Hemendra sort of answered the question saying that the problem has really got worse than maybe the last time we discussed it, which was about 6 months ago, but it's come back again now in some ways to haunt us.
Yeah, Govind, the way we look at it is there are two parts to this entire problem. So one is recognition that such a problem exists, and then once that is done, we can move on to the resolution part. So if you look at the weak assets or the non-performing assets which are there in the bank's books, these are not assets which have been originated in the last year or two. These have been there in the books for last several years, and they are now being recognized as non-performing assets from the second half of FY 2016. And that's what's happening now. Banks are recognizing that these are non-performing assets, and that process is not yet complete. So the way we are looking at it is in FY 16 there was a large amount of slippages to NPAs. The level of slippages was around 6%. That is coming down to around 4.5% to 5% this year, and it will progressively come down. But the level of NPAs will still go up definitely into next year as well. And the thing is that once we recognize that these are the non-performing assets, then we can move on to resolving them. So the way I would look at it is the problem, the full extent of the problem is yet to come to the surface, but the degree of accretion to NPAs will keep coming down.
So if we were to assume that we've recognized the problem to some extent, let's say $133 billion or the equivalent amount, what's the way forward as it stands today? So the Deputy Governor seems to feel that we should now move ahead with the separation of assets, create a bad bank, so it's very clear where the bad assets are lying, and that should really absorb all the blows going forward.
Yeah, so there are again two types of solutions which are there. One is there are the current tools which are available to the banking system. There is an SDR mechanism, 525, S4A. These are the tools which RBI has given. They can be used more effectively to resolve them. At the same time, there is the new insolvency and bankruptcy code which has been passed by both houses of parliament earlier this financial year. And once that becomes effectively implementable, which we believe will take around 1.5 to 2 years at least. So that is when banks can actually move against these defaulters and effect a quick recovery. Now, the problem with the Indian non-performing asset scenario over the last several years is that the recovery has been very, very abysmal. So what we are seeing is that if there is a default, it's around approximately 25% of that gets recovered over a 4-year time frame. So most of what is defaulted is actually having to be written off. Contrast that with examples in say US or Japan, where the recovery is around 80 to 90% over a 1-year time frame. So hopefully this insolvency and bankruptcy code, which has specified timelines for recovery and resolution, which is 6 to 9 months. So if that is effectively implemented going forward, it could augur well for the system, but we will need to wait and watch.
And we'll talk about the companies as well. So we've talked about one end of the problem or one side of the problem, which is the banks. We'll talk about the others. So what's your sense, Hemendra, between, let's say, using the tools that are already at the reserve banks or the government or the country's disposal versus trying to set up new structures?
Firstly, all these tools, they've all been failures. When they were launched by the RBI, they came with great expectations, but really they have not lived up to those expectations at all.
And why is that?
As the main issue is that of resolving an actual recovery of the bad debt, which in Indian operating conditions is normally extremely difficult. You have seen successive, you had Check Bouncing Act which was passed, which was thought to be the remedy. You've had the SAFARSI, but all these, they come and they go and nothing seems to happen, and the bad debts in India keep mounting. Now the thing is, it is not just an issue of recognition, because you see, if the banks were to recognize all the bad debts today, you will see gigantic losses. Now if the government does not recapitalize them to the extent that they require, you would create a panic. In foreign countries, they would stop recognizing these banks letters of credit and guarantee. So when you have large losses in the banking sector and you want to disclose them, you must simultaneously have a massive equity recapitalization plan in motion, because one without the other is going to create a panic in your economic system, which no bank or no government really wants.
Right. So then, which is, I would imagine, tantamount to kicking the can down the road if you're all waiting and watching to see what will happen.
You see, what is happening is that the RBI under Governor Rajan was pushing for disclosure, which is indeed a noble objective. But if you do not have a corresponding equity recapitalization plan in place, which is very obvious because of these very miserly contributions from the government, you are going to say the losses will come up and there's going to be panic on the street, which no economy, no government really wants.
Right. Okay. So, Krishnan, the companies who have essentially or are essentially responsible for the state of affairs in the banks, are they in any better position today? Because we've been hearing so much talk about some part of the highway project coming back, some power projects getting back on track, some infrastructure projects getting back on the rails. Is that likely to help? Are we anywhere near an improvement in scenario thanks to that?
See, I would say there is a marginal improvement, but bulk of the problem continues to be there. If we look back and see what has caused this massive increase in NPAs, it is essentially largely coming from large corporates and high exposures to over-leveraged corporates, and now their cash flows have got stretched. So if we go back 6 to 7 years, many of the corporates looked at the low interest rate regime and went for a huge borrowing spree to set up new capacities in the hope that down the line demand will improve and their business model will grow. But what has happened is that demand situation has not panned out, and the capacities that they have put up, they have either grossly underutilized or many of the capacities are still WIP, work in progress. So what that has meant is these corporates are having stretched balance sheets, high leverage ratios, and are unable to repay the loans they have taken from the banks. So that situation in many sectors like infrastructure, investment driven sectors like commodities is still to improve. So there has been some improvement with non-core assets being sold off, cash flows coming in, but I would say that is just the tip of the iceberg. We need to see a much more broad-based improvement in the demand scenario for these entities or equity infusions before we can say that things are going to look up going forward.
Right, Hemendra, so last word, we're running out of time. So what's your response and the way forward?
See, one is that you have to really re-examine your entire economic model, because under this reform program, you allowed the private sector to come into infrastructure in a big way. Now, infrastructure typically anywhere in the world is a very long gestation, high risk, and you hardly get any financial returns. Now, when you allow the private sector to come in, they cannot take these type of risk, or they need a massive subsidy. You should really have allowed only the the government or the public sector to set up these assets, because in case of a slowdown, it's a national asset. Here the asset now rests with the owner, and some of them have really siphoned out the monies. So you have to re-examine your entire economic model, which nobody wants to do, because everybody says reform. You keep doing more privatization, and this is a direct and a negative fallout of your entire privatization program. That infrastructure should not be allowed to be entered by the private sector in a big way.
Right.
And this to me is the major error which
But you're
nobody likes
separating
to talk
infrastructure
about.
from, let's say, bank ownership. Banks, you're saying, should be privately run or privately
No,
owned?
you see, in any economy, and this is again, in any economy, especially which is going through a downturn, if you privatize the majority of your banks, then what will happen is private sector is risk averse, as we very clearly see, they don't want to invest. Now, if your banking sector also becomes risk averse, which is bound to be under private ownership during an economic slowdown, where is the stimulus to the economy? Who will take that risk? See, this is exactly
So,
see
so we're run out of time almost. The last 30 seconds. So you're saying, okay, then don't touch the banks right now except to recapitalize them, but bring infrastructure back into the arms of government, so to speak.
Bring back
at least roads.
At least nationalize these assets which are going nowhere. At least you nationalize them, you get a profitable PSU to manage it, or a very good quality, a private party to run it. And you go after these errant corporate borrowers, and you do a massive recapitalization of the banking system, which of course is unviable, because no one likes to see a higher fiscal deficit, unfortunately. So we are going to be stuck in this mess for a long period of time.
Right, hopefully not very long. We've run out of time, Hemendra. Thank you, Krishan, for joining in as well. That's all we have time for on Policy Watch this week. We'll be back next week, same time. Thanks for watching.